Welcome, everyone, to Popcorn Therapy. This is a little bit of a special episode. Usually I'm talking about a TV show, a movie, whether old or new. And in this episode, I'm actually going to be sharing a recording of an event I did around my new book, which is called Maiden, Warrior, Mother, Crone, published by Verbena Books. So this book is all about goddesses, divine feminine stories, mythology, folk tales. So, before pop culture, there was mythology, there was religion, there was the stories that you would hear around the fire, in the dead of winter. And so you're actually going to hear one of the stories that, actually the first story of Maiden, Warrior, Mother, Crone, the story of Persephone's call to the Underworld. And many of these stories I am retelling in a different way. So this is probably going to be a little bit of a different Persephone story than the one that you know if you do already know it. So you're going to hear that story, and then there's an edited version of the discussion that we had on that day. And I loved this experience so much, sharing the story and being able to talk about it with other folks. So you might hear more of this stuff in the future, but just be aware that this is a little bit different from our usual popcorn therapy format. So if you're here for the first time and you want to really listen to something a little more current, feel free to check out the library of past popcorn therapy so that you can listen about something that you've seen recently. I do now have a page where you can tip me. Creating this podcast, it's something that I really do just for the love of it. It's not something that I get paid for in any way. And those of you content creators out there, you probably know it is incredibly hard to monetize your social media if you're in Canada, and Spotify and stuff like that. I am so happy to just kind of share this podcast. I love having these conversations. Obviously, I would love for you to buy my book. That would be really awesome. Rate it, review it. All of those things do really help me. And if you feel like supporting financially, if you have the resources to do that and you want to share a little bit of that with me and what I do and the co-hosts that I have on here occasionally, you can tip me. So you can go to juliepeters.ca/tip me, follow that link, and you can tip any amount you want. You can tip a couple dollars if you feel like it. And if you tip $50 or above, I will send you a special tarot recording just for you. So you would just send me an email. If you have a question or something, you can send me that, anything you want to know, and I'll do a little mini tarot reading just for you to say thank you for that tip. Otherwise, sit back, relax, and enjoy the story of Persephone as you've probably never heard it before. Persephone was as beautiful as her mother, with long, loose hair like corn silk, skin as smooth as fresh milk, and eyes the blue of cornflowers. She was known as Kor, the maiden, and the goddess Demeter's beloved only daughter. Persephone would spend her days playing in the woods with the wild animals, flowers, nymphs, and dryads of Demeter's realm. Some days she would get quiet and listen to them talk to each other, which is how she heard the tales of her mother, the goddess of grain, and why they never went to Mount Olympus, where the rest of her mother's family lived. She heard that the great god Zeus, her mother's brother, had done something terrible to Demeter. After that, she'd made her home on the ground where she could tend to the fruits and flowers of the earth, planting the seeds and pruning the trees. Persephone loved her life as it was, but she often wondered. She wondered about Olympus and the gods up there. She also wondered about what was beneath her. What happened to the seeds when they went into the dark earth and then mysteriously broke ground sometime later? When Demeter gave her a handful of seeds, Persephone would gently part the earth and plant them inside. She would cover them up with the soft dirt and whisper to them, telling them that everything would be all right, that they would know just what to do in the dark. Then she would lay on her belly and press her ear to the ground, seeing if she could hear the seeds whisper back. Sometimes she did hear something. It wasn't like whispering, not like anything she'd heard before. A song she couldn't quite place. A call, a tune, a prayer. She didn't know, but she would stay like that for a long time, eyes closed, listening. One night, Persephone was laying on the earth, as was her custom, listening to this strange underground song, when suddenly it spoke. Do you want to know? It startled the girl so much that she bolted upright and ran, not knowing whether she was running away or towards something. Finally, she slowed and found herself in a beautiful glen that she'd never seen before. It was dark and quiet, strangely beautiful, and in the center were growing the most beautiful flowers she had ever seen in her life. They were deep purple and blood red, perfect and strange, like a shadowy version of the bright yellowy narcissus she knew so well. As she leaned down to cup her hands around the strange flowers, the earth opened into a great chasm, and the darkly handsome god Hades appeared before her. He was driving a golden chariot pulled by 4 steeds as black as night. Without a word, he gathered her up and took her with him, the earth swallowing them both. With Persephone gone, the glen again went quiet. The narcissus flowers wilted, leaning their sorry cheeks against the earth as if in mourning. The bright moon darkened, and a new chill shivered through the air. Demeter could not understand what had happened to her beautiful daughter. She called and called for her, desperately seeking for her beloved child. She wept, her salt tears stinging the earth. She stopped tending to the fruit and flowers of the earth, withdrawing her fertile energy, and the ground became cold and quiet. No corn grew in the fields. No animals approached each other, stopping the flow of milk or young. The land appeared to die all around Demeter, as if it was mourning with her. Months passed, and the gods began to miss their sacrifices. Demeter's friend, Hecate, goddess of magic, was worried. They had been searching together for 10 days and 10 nights, and they were exhausted. Hecate spoke. Dear friend, there is one place we haven't looked. Demeter looked up at her friend, expectant. I was afraid to say anything because I wasn't sure, but the night Persephone went missing, I heard a great crack in the earth. I suspect Persephone is in the underworld with Hades, who wanted her hand in marriage so much. Demeter's eyes went black with fury, immediately knowing her friend was right. She had known Hades had his eye on her daughter, as had everyone else, and her efforts to protect her from the violence she had endured at the hands of men had at last failed. Demeter knew she could not follow her daughter to the underworld, but she could have words with her brother Zeus. She flew up to Olympus, rage in her heart for what had been done to her and her daughter and so many others. Zeus knew the moment he saw her the reason his sister had come to his throne. Return her to me, Demeter said, her jaw tight, or I shall never attend the earth again. You shall never receive another sacrifice for one of your beloved starving humans. Zeus knew better than to further push the goddess of the land and human life. So he called for Hermes, the messenger, to go down to the underworld and retrieve his sister's daughter. When Hermes arrived in the underworld, he found Hades and Persephone walking the halls together, deep in conversation, close but not touching. He noticed that she kept her eyes averted from his gaze until he looked away, and then she would stare at his face, a slight blush coming over her cheeks. Hermes watched as she spoke to a newly dead soul, soothing them, helping them to enter their new existence without fear. Persephone looked uncannily like a queen of the underworld. Hermes sat the two down, explaining that Zeus wanted Persephone to return to the world above, to be with her mother. As Persephone learned that she could go home now, she was surprised to find she wasn't sure she wanted to. She loved the underworld. It was where the song that had been haunting her for so long had been coming from. She had found that she had a special talent for welcoming the dead into their new home, helping to soothe and nurture these very different underground seeds than the ones she used to whisper to in the above world. Despite the suddenness of his abduction, Hades had been kind to her, seeming to regret causing her fear, but unsure about how to make her feel comfortable. Persephone looked at Hades, unsure of what to do. The god of the underworld seemed to understand her right away, without needing to hear her speak. He picked up a bowl of fresh pomegranate seeds and offered it to her. My dear, you are free to leave if you wish, but before you go, eat some of my food. It will keep you connected to me and this world forever. Persephone plucked 6 pomegranate seeds from the bowl and put them in her mouth, savoring the sweet and sour taste of the seeds. It was the first food she had eaten in the underworld, knowing this choice would bring her back to Hades and his mysterious dark realm. Then she took Hermes' hand and allowed him to take her home to her mother. When at last Demeter could hold her daughter again, Persephone wept as her mother wept. These tears of joy refilled the rivers and ponds with fresh new water, nourishing the earth, beginning the process of bringing the land back to life. The new shoots again began to push through the dirt, the grapes began to ripen on the vine, the animals began to turn to each other once again, creating milk and young, and the gods would once again receive the smoke from the human sacrifices. But an agreement had to be made. For the 6 pomegranate seeds that Persephone ate, she would spend 6 months of each year in the below world with Hades, who would indeed become her husband. There, she would welcome the dead, helping them to transition into this new realm. Though her mother continued to grieve each year, filled with winter-making rage and sorrow, each year she would return to joy with her daughter, bringing life back to earth as spring and summer. When she slept in one place, Persephone would dream of the other, knowing she was a goddess of the above and the below, of death and life, not merely the core maiden anymore. As a maiden, Persephone had wanted to know the song of the dead. Now she was their queen. The end. I'm just going to show you this image again. Nadia Murash did the images for this book, and she really read the chapters. Like, I love how she has Persephone laying with her belly down, listening to that underground sound, and that little skull sort of in the underworld that she can kind of hear those spirits under there. I feel like she really captured what I was trying to do with this chapter. And that's a motif that laying belly down and listening is a motif that recurs throughout this book into my next book about goddesses, and it actually recurs in my tarot book that I'm writing right now as well. So there's something about that listening under, like really wanting to get close to the ground and listen, that's just really with me right now, I think.
Oh, I just loved how poetic the whole thing was. It just felt like a song in some ways. So thank you. It was beautifully written, incredibly read, and yeah, it feels like so special to be a part of hearing that.
Thank you, Mary.
I think the part, and actually the illustration that goes with it, also really resonated with me. Just that idea of like planting these seeds, and I think there was something like this idea that they would know just what to do in the dark, and I really liked that I don't know, that imagery, or like that what that brought to mind. And then in addition to that, them whisper, saying back when she was listening, like, do you want to know? And just the surprise when when kind of, those inquiries into the universe are answered. And like, even though you've been asking, and knowing, there's like a knowing there, but then also this equal amount of like surprise when the answer from whatever fill in the blank the universe comes back.
Yeah, I think there is something about that deep listening that some of you have maybe experienced where, yeah, you don't know if you're ever going to get an answer back. But sometimes it comes in some sort of way, right? And yeah, I think too, that idea of knowing what to do in the dark, that's something that, the darkness is something that I work with a lot in counseling and so on, that idea of sort of going into those dark places within yourself and trusting that you know what to do there. I feel like so many of us really fear those parts of ourselves and going into those places. And maybe you're that seed that knows, right? Like maybe you can just trust yourself in that place.
I think it's the language of or the song, the strange underground sound. And I'm just going back to this idea of the seeds being planted as Persephone is going through this whole um, character arc. It's almost like the title of your book becomes the journey that she goes through. But I was thinking, what is that warrior phase? Part of that is being in this mode of listening. I don't know, that something about that feels like shifting the concept of the warrior to like what is the work? It's to actually answer that call
Mm.
and become kind of mother to the seeds in a way,
Mm.
and
Yeah.
then take her place as the queen, the crone, in her, becoming the queen of the dead.
Hmm.
That whole trajectory of um, almost like choosing between life and death, and then realizing there's something beautiful about death that actually gives life to everything else.
That's so insightful, Stephen. I really appreciate that. And yeah, I absolutely found that. So the title of the book is Maiden, Warrior, Mother, Crone. And you're exactly right. Like each of the phases, it's like one can't exist without the others, right? Like they need each other. And when you get the book and you read all the stories, you'll see how they weave together in a circle rather than in a line. So we start with Persephone, we end with the Cailleach, which is the Winter Queen of Scotland, and she's a crone character, but the story is really about her and her daughter, Bridget, who is like the spring goddess. So it has a real parallel to um, Persephone and Demeter, and it's kind of about how the Cailleach and Bridget have to work together to create the cycles so that we return to Maiden from Crone. Um, and I love that idea that the warrior is the one that answers the call. I think that's a really appropriate way of thinking about it for sure. Um, and I think warrior kind of spreads through a lot of the other phases as well.
My husband is in the throes of planting 900 acres
Mm.
of corn. And so like I feel like this made me feel really like almost sentimental about watching the little seeds coming up and all the little rows. Like I want to go lay in a cornfield.
Totally.
It
And
feels a
Demeter,
little more magical now.
yeah, and it is. It is magical, right? Like that's easy to forget. And yeah, you're sort of in that environment where you actually see those cycles and how they work, and you're sort of closer to what they mean throughout the cycle of the season, because
Right.
most of us are quite disconnected from, the spring is nice, but it also means things are coming back to life, right? And summer is hot and fun, but that's also like it's when everything ripens, and it's like harvest time used to be like our survival. Like that's how we knew if we were going to survive the winter or not. So these cycles, they still mean everything to us, but a lot of us are quite disconnected from that. And as I was writing this book and the two following, I was very inspired by Sophie Strand, who some of you know, Stephen, you know her writing. I think you might have recommended her to me actually. But she does a lot of, it's all about rerouting myth, like going back to like what does this myth have to do with the land and like your relationship with the earth. And so I was really writing these stories, I think probably especially the second in the series that'll come out later this year. Um, really in relationship to like what was this place like, what was the dirt like, what were the trees doing at this time, and how does this matter seasonally, because Maiden, Mother, and Crone also represent spring, summer, and winter. That's the cycle that we're talking about when we talk about the goddess.
I really enjoyed hearing you read it. It reminds me of the joy of story time at libraries and in school, and I think that's so often something we are taught to dismiss as we get older, to not play, or that's just silly. And I've just been feeling more drawn that that's something I've been denying myself, is this feeling that I don't deserve to play, that I have to produce or work or show something, which again is so much of our culture. And but something that I find interesting about the story of Persephone is how she's very traumatically taken, and yet she's almost thriving in it, and toward the end, that she finds a way to make it her own. And it's reminding me of the power of darkness. And I was doing some writing Thursday in a grief support group that I participate in, speaking of cycles, that I just feel like definitely healing is cyclical, and it feels so much like I've been in the dark night of the soul for so long. And I described it being like a star sucked into a black hole. And yet even through that, you're transformed, and it doesn't mean that you're gone. Just like I believe when a soul passes on, they're just in a different form. And so I'm trying to kind of look at things from that lens right now, where I feel just like I'm been dying over and over again in so many different ways, and for so many different reasons. And I liked, Stephen, how you talked about the character arc and coming full circle. And I love that you put the warrior in there, because, usually I always just see the maiden, Mother Crone. And I'm really, really trying to lean into that archetype of the warrior when it just feels like too much for whatever reason, when the artwork is just beautiful. Thanks, Julie, for sharing all of that and your journey. And
Yeah, thank you so much, Mindy. I think really that piece about the traumatic entrance into the underworld, and then making it work for her, or finding out that she always belonged there, actually, in certain ways, that she was meant to be the queen of this place. And that's a motif that again comes up with the maiden. It's sort of like the maiden always has to become whatever the next thing is, whether it's warrior, Mother Crone, something else. Because the maiden is really about like innocence, right, and potential. And as I'm writing the book on tarot right now, that's the fool, right? The fool falls off the cliff or jumps off the cliff to this journey that goes to the underworld. And right now I'm writing the tower chapter, that sort of region around death and the tower, and then the star, which is the return to light, right? And you return. So the next maiden is Inanna, and you know a bit about her story too. She very similar to Persephone. She enters the underworld innocent. She dies there, but she does come back to life, the same but different, right? And the same but different, I feel like, is a phrase that has resonated with me for many, many years, where you go through this cycle and you can return, but you'll never be the same as you were before. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Like, there can be beautiful things about that. So a couple things I wanted to say about this story is, so classically, this myth is called the Rape of Persephone. Right? That's the name of it. And classically, the story is told as a horrible trauma, right, with an unhappy ending, where Persephone is abducted by Hades, and Demeter grieves, which causes winter. And because Persephone eats the 6 pomegranate seeds, she has to return to the underworld for 6 months of a year. And it's often told in this way of, it's horrible that happened. She, whether accidentally ate the seeds or was forced, like, that part of the story is never really told, like why she eats the seeds. Because theoretically she probably would have known that eating the food of the underworld, is means that you're tied to that place forever. And in some version of the story, she holds off for a really long time. She's really hungry, but like eventually she does make that choice to eat the seeds, right? So I heard a version of this story from Natalie Rousseau, who some of you may know. She has been on my podcast a couple of times. We do Witches on Witches. And she has a wonderful online course called The Witches Year, which is really fascinating seasonally. There's all kinds of stuff in it. But she told this version of the story of Persephone, which really included Persephone's consent and Hades' regret. Like, I thought it was a really interesting version of the tale where she speaks a bit more to like why Hades did that, how he learned to be violent with her because that was all that was around him. And a lot of Greek myth, as some of you probably are familiar with, at least the basics of it, which is that these powerful male gods tend to rape people all the time. Like, that's sort of their MO. And so Natalie conceived that as, you know, Hades is watching the way his brothers interact with women, and the only way he knows how to do that is to abduct, but that's not actually how he wanted to do it. And when he sees the fear on Persephone's face, he immediately regrets it. And they develop this kind of sweet relationship in the underworld where he's trying to figure out how to make her feel comfortable. He's giving her lots of space, like they're having these conversations, and they fall in love in a much more consensual way. And like it kind of blew my mind to hear the story told in that different way. So this story was very inspired by that aspect from hers. As I was doing this research on Persephone, there's an older story of Persephone and Demeter, which doesn't involve Hades at all. There are no men in this story. So historically, there's sort of pre-Hellenic Greece was a place that involved a lot of goddess worship. So there's sort of archaeological evidence that shows that Demeter, Persephone, Pandora, actually, the one, you know, Pandora's box, that story about this like idiot girl who opens the box, she was actually a goddess of like the gifts of the material world for a long time. Hera was there as well. So there were all these goddesses that were worshipped at that time. And so then the Northerners, the Zeus worshippers, came in and kind of took over this culture and inserted themselves into this culture. And a lot of the time when that sort of colonization happens, it's not a complete eradication of the previous culture. It's intermarrying, intermingling, kind of like interacting with that culture. So the rape of Persephone may actually be an allegory for the rape of that culture, for like the insertion of the Zeus worshippers coming in and forcing this sort of marriage between the gods and the goddesses. I don't talk about Hera in this book in particular, but she's interesting because if you know anything about Hera, you know her as kind of a bitch. She's sort of like the mean one, who's always enacting revenge, and she's always really jealous of Zeus and so on. From this perspective, again, if that unhappy marriage is an allegory of her having once been the queen of her land, Zeus comes in and now he's the king and he's taken over and all these things, it makes sense that she would be more ornery because then, you know, maybe the story is told in a different way. It's like maybe this wasn't a consensual place. She now has to share her queendom with this dude who showed up, right, and forced that. So I thought that was a really interesting piece. And one of the ways that we can think about this too is that a lot of pre-patriarchal goddess cultures would have goddesses that really embodied light and dark, life and death, love and war. Like they kind of held everything. And the god character was often like, she'd have a consort for sure, and he would sometimes be a god of something, but she was always supreme in this way. And not just in Greek culture, but in other cultures as well, you can see how the goddess gets split into a light and a dark version. So it's sort of like, you know, Persephone and Demeter used to do it all together. And there's actually one of Demeter's names is, I always say this word, it's a weird word to say, chthonic Demeter. So she's the Demeter of the underworld. Like that word means of the underworld. Because Demeter, the goddess of grain, where does the grain come from? The underworld, the seeds of the underworld, right? Like the death creates regeneration that has to grow back up through the earth. So of course, Demeter would have been a goddess of the underworld as well as grain and life and so on. The dead were called the Demetrioi, the people of Demeter, actually, for a period of time in Greece. And so she was very connected to the underworld. But with this sort of rise of patriarchy, the need to pull these things into binaries, to have light and dark, it sort of created the separation between Persephone and Demeter. So they had to be in different realms, even though the older version of the story, which I cite this in the book, but there's a book called The Lost Goddesses of Ancient Greece. I think that's what it's called, by Charlene Spretnak, where she kind of goes over all of these ancient pre-patriarchal goddess stories. And she has a story about Persephone and Demeter. You know, they're doing their thing, they're tending the land, all of this stuff, and Persephone hears a call to the underworld, and she really feels that she wants to be in that place. And Demeter knows that she does her best work in the above world, like growing the land. And so they kind of make this agreement together, mother and daughter, like, okay, you take the underworld, I'll take the above world, we'll work together in this way. And so, you know, the idea that winter is not a punishment, it's like, you know, a beautiful part of the cycle that's necessary, is part of that older story and part of what I wanted to pull into this story as well.
I really also like that, Julie. The idea of the light and dark and non-duality, and the idea of colonization and the allegory of that, and also it reminds me of some other goddesses with similar stories, like Medusa, whose beauty was used against her, and especially by other women ultimately. And part of the really painful, a large part of the discomfort is that I feel like I don't know who I am anymore exactly. And so that's part of that I see as like that painful destruction, is just, I thought I'd planted these seeds and I knew what the package, you know, this is what I was planting. I don't know what the hell is going to come up now, but trusting that something beautiful will unfold. And so that what you're talking about reminded me of this idea of surrender, trusting and surrendering even though you don't know. And so that's a theme that's been coming up in this other grief group we call it the Hearth Collective. But this idea of one of the teachers was helping me a few weeks ago when I was just really, really struggling with grief, that he said to lean into the idea of not needing to find a solution or a resolution, and that there's power in just surrendering to, I don't know. Yeah, there is that darkness of like the seed, and you don't know, you can't see it because it's in the dark. So thank you for this beautiful story rendition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so Medusa is in this book as well. You'll love this version, I think, of Medusa. She's also got some interesting, like, older myths that are related to her, where you're like, oh, okay, there's like more to this story than what we assume, right? There's also something about identity, what you were saying there, like that idea that, you know, we go to the underworld and we get stripped of our identity, which is Inanna's story, right? Like Inanna, this goddess, as she goes into the underworld, she removes a piece of her finery, or, you know, her royal dress, or whatever it is, like all of the things that make her who she thought she was. She has to remove all of those pieces and enter into the underworld nude, in order to sort of become someone new. And she puts all the pieces back on again, but there's more there, right, afterwards. And I feel like a lot of the time today, when you think of a goddess, it'll be like goddess of X thing, and it's like goddess of grain or goddess of whatever. And, you know, really in these older stories, they were never just one thing. There were lots of things, you know. They could hold so many realities within them at one time. They also weren't expected to be perfect, right? I mean, Inanna might be one of my favorite ones because she's so flawed. Like, she makes mistakes, you know, she's arrogant. Like, she tries things and they don't always work out for her. And I there's something about that I appreciate and relate to. You know, she's got some sort of humanness in her, and a lot of these older gods were like that. They were fickle, you know, because they controlled the weather or whatever it was, and they didn't always listen to you and give you what you wanted, like, you know, because they had their own agendas and so on. And so I think there's something nice about imagining yourself in the underworld and wondering what your identity is, and then remembering that, like, you don't have to know, or you don't have to be just one thing, right? It can be multiple, right? And I think many of us have experienced, like, in our lives, we all experience Underworld, right? It's the hero's journey, the tarot journey. Like we all know what that's like when we're in those dark places. And maybe we do it over and over again, right? Like we cycle back and forth between the light and the dark over and over again. And it changes us, right? But there's more. Often there's more, right? Like when we're just maiden, when we're the sort of innocence before trauma or difficulty or whatever it is, like that's beautiful and it has potential, but it's also sort of surface, right? And then as we go through these underworld darker cycles, like it makes us richer beings. Like we have more to offer, we have more compassion, sort of that concept of post-traumatic growth. Like we have more to offer, more to share. It's easier to connect with. Yeah, we understand, other people when they're in their underworlds, because like it's so human to be in that place. There are gifts there, absolutely. Not always obvious right at the beginning, but there's always gifts that we find in those dark places, right?
It's just bringing up this phrase, they tried to bury us, but they didn't know we were seeds.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's also a motif that shows up in a few of these stories. So when Demeter and Persephone are reunited and their tears water the land, that's a motif that comes up in this book and the following one, and the tarot book, actually, for that matter, because I guess I love this motif. The goddess Isis, the Nile River floods once a year, and it's said that that's because she sits at the Nile River and cries for her husband, who, in a similar kind of Persephone way, he dies, comes back to life. He needs to sort of be in the underworld forever, and they're separated. So once a year she cries, and her tears flood the Nile, and that's what creates the inundation. And there's another story that is in the book coming out in November of this year. Arvid, who's sort of an Irish goddess, her brother dies in a very sort of similar Isis Osiris way, and he's buried in the ground, and her tears water the grave, and from the grave come all the herbs that create healing. She's like sort of the goddess of herbalism, and all of these healing herbs are created from her tears and his seeds. And so I think there's something too about like the tears as holy water, the sacredness of tears, like the tears watering those seeds that have been buried in the dark, like you just said, Stephen. Like they didn't know that we were seeds, and it's that grief that waters that potential, right? And then the growth can come, but it's almost like we need the grief, we need the tears to be able to allow those seeds to be nourished, to grow, right?
I love, that's one of my favorite sayings. But what you're speaking to about grief is, Julian, the tears is that suppressing your grief so suppresses your joy. And lately it's been hard for me to have my grief and my joy. So I just appreciate that reminder that of, again, kind of that non-duality, because grief is often, seen as negative, kind of like anger is, versus joy or happiness, or so I really like the safety of this space to be able to lean into those things.
Yeah, and I feel like that's patriarchy is all tied in with capitalism and white supremacy and colonialism and all these other systems and so on. But I feel like that is something that as I was doing this research, and it sort of surprised me how often I would do a little research and there was this deep ancient storytelling related to these goddesses that had so much more than the stories that we tend to hear. And it was really like, I feel like I have this sort of experience with goddess mythology. And my sort of classic story about this is, I was raised in a Christian church, not super religiously, but like we went to church every Sunday. I heard the stories, all of that stuff. And so that's kind of the model that I'm familiar with. And that's, of course, the, in Western culture, it tends to be the dominant religion is Christianity. And I was in high school, and actually my teacher was a deacon, or an ex-deacon, I think. We saw him at Pride once, so we were like, oh, that's why you're no longer involved. But anyway, he was very involved with the church for a while, and he was a really wonderful world religions teacher. And he was sharing us these slides and kind of explaining how, like, once upon a time, the goddess was what people would worship, and like it was obvious that the goddess would be supreme in the universe because female bodies were able to give birth. And before people knew how that worked or that men were even involved, it was sort of like this miracle that would happen. So like obviously God was a woman, was kind of how he explained it at the time. And like it was like the lights were dim and we're watching these things on the projector. And it was just there was something that felt so powerful for me in my body to even just imagine that there was a world in which my body could be seen as powerful. And it was in that moment of seeing it from the opposite side that I even recognized like how powerful that narrative is around God being a singular person. I mean, a lot of the cultures I'm looking at are pantheistic. Is that the word for it? Yeah, there's, many gods and goddesses, not just one. So it's kind of it's like weird from the course of history that so much of our culture has a singular male god now. Like it's actually quite weird in the history of time. It's rarely been like that. And so, I think coming back to that idea that goddess can be many things, like goddess can be possible in the dark, in the light, with grief and joy. And so all of this to sort of come back to this idea that, in a patriarchal, capitalist, blah, blah, blah sort of culture, one of the results of that is our emotions get really suppressed, right? There are certain emotions that are okay to show, but even those, not too much. Like even joy, if you think about like a lot of the time, even a child expressing joy will be like like too loud or like too much or like sit still or be quiet, make your body smaller kind of thing. We're so uncomfortable with that in this culture. And so I feel like, as many of you know, so much of the work I do is like bring up those emotions, let those emotions be there, like they're sacred to you, they're part of your power. Don't be afraid of even the grief and the joy and the anger and all of those difficult ones, right? Because I think it makes us more powerful when we have access to those emotions, and when we can only show the little bits of the ones that are kind of culturally sanctioned. I think that makes us smaller and less powerful, right? Which is sort of like a very intimate but political intention I have in a lot of the work I do, including in these books, for sure.
I think that idea of the polytheistic kind of nature of the feminine, goddesses can be many things, is really intriguing because the imperial colonial kind of bent of colonization is there's only one way, and if you don't fit that way, then you're excluded. You're in the exclusion zone, and that's like the place of death and destruction. But the diversity of life that comes from a seed, all these different seeds, that just feels like the exact opposite of this is actually how life works. So yeah, I love that.
Yeah, it's multiple, right? Like in order for a seed to grow, it needs earth, it needs water, it needs fungi, maybe, like it needs sort of other beings. In Braiding Sweetgrass, Robin Wall-Kimmerer's book, and I reference this a little bit, she talks about beans, corn, and squash. They're three sisters, and they're three plants that they kind of need each other. Like you can grow them alone, but they don't do as well. And like when the three are planted close together, that's when they tend to thrive. And this is the sort of indigenous, ways of knowing that we're kind of lost in monoculture, among other things. It's just like you plant the seed and the seed grows. There's so much to it, right? Like there's so much multiplicity. And I feel like there's something really, really beautiful and empowering for me in thinking about that and encountering it over and over again in these mythologies from, many different parts of the world.
Someone just brought this up in another meeting right before this. Bunch of old guys, actually. But it was the call of the forest, because I brought up Diana Beresford Kroger. She's a polymath, but rooted in kind of Celtic Celtic wisdom of the forest. And so she's got a film called Call of the Forest. And so just answering the call, Persephone answering that call feels like it's somehow connected because Diana was actually from a child looking for how do I understand the code of what's the language of these plants, and then recognized as she was going through her own education of chemistry and biology and all of these things, and then she realized that biochemistry was the code, and that's a really interesting kind of idea of how the seeds are carrying all of this wisdom of like the whole universe becoming alive, and just how powerful that is.
Yeah. So I'll just refer back to Sophie Strand for a moment. Sophie Strand's novel, fictionalized memoir of Mary Magdalene, and there's so much in there about like, what if Jesus's teachings were about seeds? Like, what if there's a different meaning to the mustard seed, right, than what we tend to understand? And what if he was trying to teach about the divine in the land, right? Like, what if he was trying to teach in this really different way than necessarily what we've gotten? And another part of the reason I wanted to do this, and I'm so glad that you guys are here and that we're having this discussion. Sophie Strand also talks about like living myth and storytelling. Mindy, you were mentioning this before too, like that experience of story time where you're like in a circle and everyone is like in this shared experience with a story, which like can happen, but I guess it's not something, it's like one of these, every winter, we used to sit around the fire and, that would be the time to listen to the stories of the elders. And that's how we would learn, how to be people and how to, work with the land and all of those things. And we don't do it that much anymore. And she talks about the difference between like a story that's written on the page has a limit because it's just stuck there on the page. Like it's kind of dead in a way because it's just there. It's a one-way relationship, right? Where it's I'm alive and I'm reading it, but the story can't talk back to me. And so it's kind of nice to do things like this where actually we can share the story because it has another life, right? It's like that seed has the opportunity to grow in other multiple ways because you can share your thoughts and I can share my thoughts on that. And, we can have this discussion about it. I mean, a book club kind of does that too, because you can open the story up into community, right? And it's interesting because I actually, this is sort of a deep cut of Julie's life, but I did my master's thesis on a poet called George Eliot Clark, who's a Canadian poet who did a lot of work on like race in Canada and stuff like that. But I specifically was doing his plays because he was working with these sort of difficult themes. But I feel like the point of it, or the interesting thing about it, was that because it was a play, it would be something alive where an audience would show up and they would share this experience together differently from a movie, which sort of has a similar thing, but it's like the audience would be there together and then they could discuss like what they had seen. And of course, the play was also in a book form, which you could read, and it's beautiful poetry. But there's something different about the possibility of something being lifted up off the page so that it can be shared. And it certainly, this book doesn't have to be shared in that way, but I love the bedtime story aspect of this book. And I'm hoping that I can read some of these to Grant at bedtime. Some of them are a little spicy. Some of the stories have like a little bit of sex and murder in them and stuff like that. But when he's ready, I feel like it would be really nice to share them as bedtime stories because they're kind of that length and so on. But that's sort of what I mean by it, right? It's like having this living connection with the story so that it doesn't have to just be like, this is the story and this is the one you have to learn. Because a lot of these stories are retellings of classic myths that are maybe controversial. I think the Medusa one. And I actually have Eve from the Bible, and I have Mary, mother of Jesus, as well in this book. So I've got some Christian mythology told in sort of a different way that's intended to also be like respectful and loving to the traditions of that. But there's so much to it, right? There's different roots that you can pull up when you're telling these stories, because that's what storytelling can do. right? It can change depending on the teller and the audience. Mm-hmm. And you know what? So in the book that's coming out in, I think it's November, which is called Witch, Healer, Priestess, Outcast. I had a Mary Magdalene chapter that got cut. So maybe I'll have a special coven where I read the Mary Magdalene story. It's very spicy. But what I found so fascinating about that is there's all this apocryphal writing and so on that shows that Mary Magdalene may have been like a major teacher of Jesus's whole thing, that she was like beside him as a teacher. It was like the two of them. But because of the way things get written down, he was really the primary one, and all of the writings by women kind of got cut out of the Bible. So yeah, it's interesting to think that like there might be a whole other way that story could have been told from her perspective. And there is a little bit of it, like there is the book of Mary, the Gospel of Mary is a text that exists within the sort of esoteric Christian tradition that was written around the same time, and it was, found in a clay jar in Egypt, and it's legitimate, but it wasn't included in the canonical Bible because who decides what's included, right? It was sort of groups of men over long periods of time and so on, that had an agenda, right? And so the way these stories get told depends a lot on the storyteller. And it is fascinating to kind of think of like, the way a lot of people talk about the Bible, even as a metaphor, like this is the Bible of whatever. It's this idea that you have a sacred text that is not living. It's a sacred text that is concrete, and it stays that way, right? And from what I understand, in the Jewish tradition, there's more of a living tradition of like rabbis who reinterpret and talk about the lessons, and it's a little less sort of set in stone. So, that aspect of it is really interesting. And I think that, there's also a way that we can think about that as ourselves as stories, like our bodies as having told the story. I think about this a lot, like my body tells the story of what I've been through in my life, right? But who tells that story? How is it interpreted? Like, what does it mean to me, right? Any scar can tell a story, but, there's lots of different ways that story can be told. And I feel like to come back to that idea of identity again, and this sort of goddess multiplicity, there's a whole style of therapy called narrative therapy that's all around this. It's like, what story are you telling about yourself? This is a Buddhist thing as well. Like, what story are you telling about yourself, and how rigid is that story? How set in stone is that story? And can you sort of ease into the margins of that story and see which pieces aren't being told, and like how it could be understood a different way? Because so much of our suffering can come from who we think we are, right? Or as my supervisor often says, what are you making it mean, right? Because if you can make it mean something else, you just have the raw material of your life.
Julia, I'm intrigued with the things that you're mentioning about how the myths are adapted into new circumstances by different cultures and different times. And I'm just wondering how much of that you get into in the book.
I would say it comes up a lot. Like, I'm writing the story, I like the phrase in conversation with the different versions of the story that have been told before, the different versions of the story that are popular. Like, I think certain of these goddesses, like many people have at least some awareness of Persephone, Medusa, Eve, Mary, but some others, like, you may not have heard the story of Sky Woman before, or the Kaliak, you may know. I hadn't heard that name before until I was doing some research. So you may not know them, but yeah, I'm trying to tell the story in a way that really pulls in the different individual pieces of, it's my agenda, right? I mean, it's like what I think is interesting about that story, and coming from a lens that's, feminist and among other things. And also, trying to use this perspective from Sophie Strand around like rerouting the myths and so on. Like, I have my version that I'm going to tell, but I want to be very clear that version is in conversation with these pieces of information that came through for me. And, myths have always been that, as you say, like they adapt to the culture that they're in, and they're useful cultural pieces, right? Like they're like every culture sort of has an origin story for how the world began. If you know the origin story of a culture, it can tell you so much about who those people are and what's important to them and what matters to them. So there's a story, is it in this book or the next one? I think it's the next one. There's a story from West Africa about how these men, these orishas, came down to try to create the world, and they were like doing all this stuff, but they forgot to consult the woman that was with them because they thought she was just there to do their hair. And they couldn't figure out why it wasn't working, and so they went back to the supreme being, and the supreme being was like, "Are you idiots? Like, what? You haven't consulted the woman at all? Like, you have to go apologize." And so they have to go apologize to this woman, and she's like, "Okay, I'll help you." And her thing is actually the sweet waters, the rivers, tears, even amniotic fluid. Like she brings life with water. But the moral of the story is really like you need to include the power of the feminine, because if you forget it, you can't create anything. And that's a very different creation myth from Eve and Adam. And there's different ways of telling that story, and I have a totally different way of telling Eve's story than she was tempted by the snake and she bit the apple and she made this mistake and she ruined everything for everyone. Like, that's often how you hear that story told. But for me, it's that she was answering the call to something outside of this small world that was static and stagnant, and that she needed to be able to experience the beauty of the meaning of life when there is death. Yeah.
So how much, I'm intrigued about how much you were reinterpreting the old stories again, or how much are you presenting them to the reader to make their own interpretation, and probably a mixture of both.
It depends on where I'm getting the story from, right? Like, Sky Woman is a story from the Haudenosaunee and Ojibwe people of North America. That's not my culture, right? That's not a story I grew up with. So I'm trying to tell that story in relationship with the writers that I learned it from, so that it's quite, loyal to where I learned it from. Whereas Eve and Mary, like, those are stories I grew up with in my culture. So I have a different relationship with those stories, and I'm really retelling those quite heavily from my own perspective, partly because I'm expecting the reader to have a little bit of familiarity with that version. Whereas the stories that I feel like people won't know as much, I'm trying to keep it a little closer to the classical version, I guess, of that story. So, I am explaining in the book, like, this is why I told the story this way, and like, this is where I got this information about the pre-patriarchal goddesses, and the classical version is this, and here's why I retold it that way.
Did you, when you were researching different stories, did you intentionally try to include stories from different continents or cultures that you wanted to try to capture multiple, if there was like an approach or how you did that, if it was based on that or other themes?
Yes, I definitely wanted a diversity of stories from different places. And it was an interesting one because I grappled with Sky Woman a little bit, like whether or not I could tell that story. And there was a long period of time actually where I was going to just retell the story as told in Braiding Sweetgrass, because I love that book. And I think, Kitty, you phrased it well. It's like, I want to elevate these stories and share them with what's the word I'm looking for? Like, with honor to those authors and so on. And there was a time where I thought, no, I can't write this story. I can't share it because it's not my culture to share. And then I thought, well, maybe it's worse to not tell it. I'm telling all these stories from Greece and all these other places, and I feel like I really do want it to be included, and I feel like it's a story that really matters. And I think when it comes to, cultural appropriation and things like that, like how you're interacting with stories from another culture, and it's important to me to do that in a way that does elevate other voices, elevate other stories and so on, without centering myself. And also while being able to say, like, this is my culture, this is my background, like, this is not, I don't know these people or this, land really. And so I'm trying to share it in those ways. And I think some of what I've learned about myself in terms of my relationship with myself as, a settler in Canada, a white person with white privilege, all of those things, I think it's easy to want to shut down around that stuff and just not touch it and avoid it because you don't want to get the shade for it, right? Like you don't want to get in trouble. And I really don't. I don't want to hurt anybody. And that came up in the next book as well, because there were certain, there were specifically the stories from West Africa. Actually, I was sort of feeling like, is it okay for me to tell these stories, and how do I do this? And, these are new to me and so on. And, definitely had some sleepless nights about it. But I think ultimately, I feel like my responsibility as a white person is to engage with my reactions to this, like with my guilt, with my shame, with all of these things, and to be willing to learn from another culture and share those things in a way that's important. I had some consultation around these things as well too. I feel like one of the things that my supervisor was talking about is, are you just retelling the story for your own benefit, or like, what is the work that you're doing, right? And for me, it was really about connecting these lines together. Like the story I'm telling is really the whole book. It's not, the stories aren't, they're separate, but they're not isolated from each other. Like they all have a relationship to each other. And what actually happened with Sky Woman was that we were waiting and waiting and waiting to get the permission from the UK publisher of Braiding Sweetgrass, to let me reprint the story from her book. We had the Canadian permission, but not from UK, and David and Charles is in UK. So we're waiting, and my publisher was like, I think you need to have a plan B and like write your own version of the story. And I lost sleep over that, and I talked to my supervisor who's Indigenous and all of these things. And finally I said, well, I'll give it a shot. I'll see what this feels like. And at first I was including all of these quotations from the different books that I was working with. But after a while, I actually found that there was a way that I could tell that story that felt really connected. Like it was with joy that I was able to share a part of Sky Woman's story where she lays belly down on the earth and places her ear to the ground and listens to not so much the underground seeds, but the seeds of the world that she's about to create from beneath her. And so for me, it's really about kind of like connecting these stories and how there is a universality to them, even though they're from different cultures. I've been reading Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey. Have any of you read that? Hey, don't bother. I wouldn't bother. So the hero's journey is like, it's this classical theory, right? That all stories have this cyclic circular structure. You probably know the idea of it. And the tarot fits into that pretty well. It's like the fool, the maiden, whatever it is, like goes on the journey, meets the divine, has an adventure, goes to the underworld, returns from the underworld, the same but different. Like that's how the story goes. So I had never actually read this book, though I knew this theory, and I've been reading it. And he does comparative mythology, so he shares mythology from different places. But what's been driving me nuts about this book is that he has a very Western-centric way of telling these stories. So I don't know if it's just me that has this experience, but I feel like he, if the story is Western in its origin, like a Christian story or something like that, he'll tell it in kind of a beautiful way. But if the story is from like an Indigenous group or something like that, he uses words like, what was the word he used, like sort of insulting words for different cultures. And it's this very like, the savages have this story where they cut their penises, and it's obviously this Freudian desire for a vagina and stuff. And it's like, okay, you're overlaying like Western ideas onto these Indigenous stories, and you're not taking the time to consider like, what did this story mean to that culture at the time. And the way he's telling those stories is often in a very othering kind of way. So I'm actually having a really hard time reading this book. Like, I don't know if I'm going to finish it. But I feel like what I'm trying to do that's different from that is I'm trying to be honest about where I'm coming from my perspective, but also think about, what does this story mean to, what could this story have meant to this land, this part of the world? And with this awareness too, that, we're all Indigenous from somewhere. Many of us have many different cultures sort of within our bodies and our experiences, and that there are things that we can relate to from all of these places. And I really don't want to do that from a place of like, all stories fit into the Freudian, And I mean, I have my feminist lens or whatever it is. I can't get away from my biases, but I'm not trying to smush them all into one mono theory. I'm trying to really give them space to be what they are on their own terms in conversation with writers or podcasters in some cases from those places, while also bringing myself to it, my experience, the pieces that resonate with me, and so on.
Thank you, Julie. I really enjoyed some of that nerdy academic stuff, so that was fun. And I wanted to comment that I really liked what you said about the power of a people's origin story. And I had actually recently listened to a meditation on that, about looking at our origin story on Insight Timer, that really resonated with me. And this is bringing up because I'm adopted. I'm finding lately, as I'm feeling so unanchored, that this idea of like, well, I don't exactly know where I fit in because I was adopted from South Korea, but I don't really feel that culture, not truly, and yet I don't always feel like I'm American. And so I really liked you bringing that up, and then also the idea of narrative therapy, which a lot of what is coming up in trauma treatment is this idea of dropping your narrative in the stories. And on a lighter note related to that, because I've been told that by multiple people that I've worked with, is that, yeah, to change your narrative. So I was working with my NARM coach one time, and she was mentioning that, like, what is your story? Or she told me that you can feel empowered one day, and the next day, if you don't, that doesn't mean that it's gone. And the stories that we tell, and I've never forgotten that. And so I told her, I said, okay, well, next time we talk, remind me I'm a badass if I forget that. Those are my words. And she was cracking up, but it's so true. Like, depending on, I don't know, whatever, so many different factors that influence how we are feeling about ourselves or other people.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to say a little bit about more about Sky Woman in particular, I grew up on the land on which that story would have been told. Like, I grew up in Haudenosaunee land, and I didn't know that, until I was much older, because in Canada, we don't tell the story of Indigenous history, and we don't necessarily learn the Indigenous names and so on. And Sophie Strand also talks a bit about like the idea that like the land that I'm on, this is the food that I eat, and it's the air that I breathe, and it's the allergies that I have, and like this is where I am, right? And so I'm not Indigenous to this place, and I also live here. Like, this is where my body exists, right? And so I have a relationship to this land that is, it's a lot of things, right? Like, it has a lot of different relationships sort of exist within my body's placement in this land. And it's not all, like, the story doesn't all have to be, I'm a colonizer, and so I'm a horrible person, and all of these things. Like, that's one way of telling the story, but there's lots of other pieces that can exist there too. And so I feel like part of what was important about telling Sky Woman's story is like rerouting that story to the land that it's on, right? Like, this is the land that I'm on. This is a story I should have learned when I was a child, right? Because it should have been like, this is the story of this land. This is the origin story of the land that you're on right now, right? I never learned that. And so I think keeping things really separate in that way, and from the perspective of being adopted too, it's sort of like, again, from that same sort of goddess perspective, like, do you have to just have one cultural identity, right? Like, do you have to just have one origin story or one narrative about who you are and where you come from? Or can you be this multiple of things where it's like, I live on this land, my biological people are from here, my adopted people are from there. Like, that's all a part of who I am. And it doesn't have to mean that I'm permanently dislocated. It can mean I'm rooted, right? Like, I can be rooted. And I know you have a complicated relationship with the land that you're on, right? Like, the place that you live, like the state and so on. But that can also have multiple relationships and realities within it, because I know you also have nourishment from, like, your cat and like, the different animals and plants that are in this place that are so much older than we are, right? So much older than those stories we have about yeah, who landed where first and what they called it and all of that stuff, right? Yeah.
No, thank you for that. It's reminding me of something that I forgot. And it is harder for me to remember that living here in Utah. and predominantly Mormon, is that something when I was able to get embodied and connect with Mother Earth, that the message I heard from her, and I believe also the Shoshone, that are the people of the indigenous of this land, was, Mindy, you belong wherever you are. And so I've been trying to remind myself of that, and what you were just speaking to reminded me of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, my people are from England and Ireland and Scotland, probably. And I've never been to Ireland. I've never been there. I've never been to that land. I'd love to go sometime, but that's not the land I've experienced. That's not where I grew up and like where my footprints are.
Yeah, I took a course on an introduction to Indigenous peoples' knowledges, and through that met someone who wrote a book about place and mapping the Stolo territory here in the Lower Mainland of Canada, in British Columbia. He contributed to a book called Orality and Literacy, and so as all of these different kinds of dualities, there's the bioregion, but there's the globe, there's place, but there's relationality. There's the subjective, but there's the objective. There's particle and wave. There's feminine, masculine, organism and environment, and so that feels like central to the story of Persephone. Of there's the shared sky and air, but then this very specific place of the underworld. But then it just that interplay that's happening between the very specific and the very general, that's kind of like ongoing in all of these stories, and just the way you're using your specific perspective as a way to kind of do what these old oral traditions would do, is like Jewish midrash is playing around with the stories, trying to understand from different perspectives the same text, and having all this marginalia to really give richness to all the different perspectives of the meanings that can be derived. So just this kind of permission that you're giving to, yeah, let's be messy. Let's engage with the stories, because that's actually kind of a non-colonial indigenous way of being in story, and bringing one's own perspective into the storytelling.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. Yeah. And I do this in therapy too, as some of you know, like it's not I'm the authority and I'm going to tell you how it is, right? It's more like, here's some research I did and here's how I feel about it. What do you think? It's like a little bit more, can we share this experience, rather than that idea of like, it's very colonial. Like therapy, the model of therapy is very colonial, right? In that sense of like, I have all the knowledge and I'm going to tell you, I'll therapize you, and so on. Yeah. So yeah, that's really important to me.
So I was imagining Persephone listening their ear to the earth, and just feeling like the earth being a womb, seeds, and I just heard something about, I think it was about prayer, actually, and it might have been Mother Teresa or something like that. Like, what do you say to God? Well, I don't say anything. I just listen. And well, then what does God say? Well, he doesn't say anything. He's listening too. So that idea of the listening is going two ways. Like the seed is listening to the mother, the maiden, the mother, the crone, right? And so I was just thinking about your journey of motherhood too, of just how you heard the call of motherhood, and it's been this deep struggle and journey to have this child, and then the call is answered by a child who, what does the child say? Well, the child just grows up and just lives, right? So it's just that kind of listening that goes back and forth like that.
Wow, I love that. I love the idea of silence as shared listening. Like rather than that feeling of like, we're alone or we're not talking or disconnection, what if it's shared listening, right? Like I'm listening to the other person or the earth or myself or whatever it is, and it's just the silence is just listening. I love that idea so much. And oh yes, absolutely, you're so right. For me, about that intense call to motherhood, despite these many experiences of like, there were many times I said to myself, I'm never doing this again. Like I don't, I can't go through this again. And I did, right? And it sort of amazes me that I kept doing it. And now there's this innocent little guy who just looks worried a lot. And, I said to him the other day too, like, we've been waiting for you for so long and I'm so glad you're here, but like, you don't have to do anything about that. Like, nothing is expected of you. Like, you can just be here, and you're perfect as you are. Like, I don't want to put pressure on him to have to be anything in particular because he's just the seed that's growing and he's just being a little guy right now, which is, everything that I need him to be is just his normal little self. Right. So that's very powerful.
In this crisis of, the polycrisis of climate change and all the other social ills, it just feels like Persephone is giving us a model for, how do we answer the call to this crisis? It's actually just to like slow down and listen. What would happen if we all did that? What would happen if we were just in that sense of presence of like what is really needed at this moment?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, thank you so much, you guys. It's been such a pleasure to, as always, hear your thoughts and responses and so on. And it's, increasing that call to be like, oh, maybe we do coven a little bit. It's just so good to be in these conversations. I find it so nourishing, and that I really do feel like it's been a gift for me to be able to share these stories in community and in conversation, because it's a different experience to get these responses and, to hear the pieces that came out for you and so on. It's a pleasure for me and makes me want to do more in some sort of way. So maybe more to come. Thank you so much. So good to see you all, and we'll be in touch soon. Thank you so much, everybody, for listening to this special episode of Popcorn Therapy featuring Maiden warrior mother Crone. Please buy this book. You can get it anywhere you buy books. And if you can rate it and review it on Amazon, especially, that really helps with the algorithm. That's where a lot of people buy books. But you can also rate it and review it on Goodreads or, wherever you do that sort of thing. It just helps me to get the book in front of more people. There is a part 2, as I alluded to, that's going to be coming out later this year, hopefully before Christmas. And there's more to come, so sort of stay tuned. Don't forget to tip me if you want to go to juliepeters.ca/tipme. And if you want to tip more than $50 or more, I will send you a specialized recording of a tarot reading just for you. Thank you so much, and see you next time for probably True Blood. I think that's what we're going to be doing next. Send me your recommendations and requests as well. I'm always happy to hear those. Thanks, everybody.